Very warm welcome to all of you for Confluence Consultants 2024 inaugural webinar. We've called it the zoo census, black swan, white elephants, and grey rhinos. And then animals kept getting added to it. So we now have a black jellyfish, for example. It's the first in the series of webinars that we're going to be doing in the next quarter, which will address a number of burning questions I'm sure a lot of you have. First and foremost, I know a lot of you have been following us on Confluence Consultants page on LinkedIn. You've liked what we write. You've given us very valuable feedback. So thank you for that. It's really hard putting yourself out there. So we really appreciate the feedback and the constant snippets of wisdom that come to us. So as you must have noticed that we've used a host of animal-themed risk management strategies while evaluating our risks and opportunities for 2024. So during the course of the webinar, if you hear a bleating, a mewing, a mooing, then it's probably just one of our analysts in character, right? So don't really get scared. My name is Shraddha Bhandari. I am partner at Confluence Consultants. I am also the ringmaster for the day. I have two animals in my herd. Nicolas, who's my co-partner, who identifies himself as an owl, an intelligence owl. He moves around gathering intelligence and making sense of the world. And Amandeep Ahuja, who's a research specialist, who identifies herself as a cat. The good part is that she also observes things, but she also wants to be judgmental. So yeah. So that's exciting. Both of them, for the next 40 to 45 minutes, I'm going to pick their brains on what intelligence have they gathered for 2024, what sense they've made of it, and what are the trends that they see panning out. Before we begin, some house rules. Please keep your videos closed and your audios muted. If you have any questions, comments, contrarian views, please use the chat box where our latest addition to the herd, our analyst Kia, will be keeping a track of everything that you say. The more contrarian you are, the more we will like it. So please bring on your animal predictions. Great. Let's get into it now without wasting much time. So it's 23 days into 2024 already. And I'm sure all of you have attended a host of top 10 risks from a number of agencies that put it out there. The themes have generally been similar. Geopolitical turmoil, US debt explosion, you've got China slowing down, structural issues like aging, AI, technology, energy transition. Questions have been raised. Is 2024 going to be the year when US finally gets into a direct conflict? It could be because of its rogue enemies like Russia, Iran, North Korea, or some of its dangerous friends. Is it the year that recession will finally happen? Is it the year when AI, elections, misinformation will be a very, very lethal combination? Is it the time when new theaters of conflict will emerge? The World Economic Forum in Davos highlighted 4 trends, which I quite liked. They call them that companies have to navigate the AI probability of doom, the disinformation and the misinformation, the culture wars on standard, whether it's ESG, on popular culture, on how you define your nationalism and geopolitics. In a sense, I feel all this doom and gloom is giving like a bad name to some of the positive things that are happening. So for example, the BRICS enlargement, will it be a tempering factor for the superpower rivalries? You've got startups coming together on things like energy transition. There are talks of an India, Middle East, startup corridor on critical technologies. So let's see how these things pan out in the course of the next couple of webinars, which our experts will do with us. We'll touch on some of these themes. But first, for the risks and what I like really doing best, putting people on spotlight. Nicolas, I'm going to come to you. I know there's a lot of talk on Black Swan, which by definition are very hard to predict. We'll do this at the very end, but I want to come to you for Grey Rhino events, moderate to high probability and a high impact. What are your top 2-3 Grey Rhino risks for 2024?
Thanks, Shraddha. Well, for the Grey Rhinos, it's really the stuff that we know, opposite to the Black Swans of the events that we don't know. The stuff that we know for sure, and that is very likely to have a major impact. The problem is that I do not see many countries, even less many companies being prepared for this. I would say number one would be that 2024 is going to be a year of massive popular discontent. I would say throughout industrialized economies, particularly throughout the European Union. We've already seen the year starting with farmer demonstrations. Some people call it farmers' revolt in Germany. I would like to remind listeners that this all started in the Netherlands last year. And we saw how it ended up in the Netherlands with a right-wing anti-Islam political party winning the elections. So we are seeing this happening in Germany. It's starting in France already. I would like to remind listeners that in France we had the Yellow Vest movement a couple of years back, and these kind of movements, tend to compound with interest. Typically, one movement picks up from where the previous movement left off and add on new reasons for discontent. So we have this issue. We have issue with how people are managing inflation. We are seeing a massive impoverishment of the middle class, again, especially in Europe. And we are seeing constant acts of terrorism throughout Europe that also feeds the discontent. People are very critical of the way governments, according to them, are failing to protect them. So when you're compounding farmers' discontent, inflation, and terrorism, I do believe that 2024 is going to be a rough year, especially in Europe. And remember, we have some presidential elections in Europe, and we have a massive European election. So this could translate into some very so-called populist parties scoring some significant wins in the European Parliament, which in turn could have a very major impact on how Europe could be managing its future economic relations and political relations with the likes of China, with the likes of the US, but also with the likes of the Middle East. A second factor, I would say, that I would like to warn companies against, it's another gray rhino because it hasn't started this year. It's the profound modification in supply chains. This has started basically since Donald Trump started his trade war against China, but this is definitely now becoming a massive problem. We are seeing how it is transforming with the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the way that the Houthis in Yemen are seriously disrupting new supply chains, and the way some new countries from the so-called global south, I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia or Ethiopia for that matter, are proposing alternatives, land bridges, alternative supply routes. So this is needed, I believe, for the world economy to continue, but this will mean a lot of companies we have to readapt and on a constant basis. And the third gray rhino that I would like to mention is that I do believe that 2024 will be a year where we see even more concrete moves towards de-dollarization. The appetite for de-dollarization is not new. We all know that BRICS basically was started with this in mind. I'm not even saying that it is an achievable objective, but I do believe that any little step made towards that direction will be a massive challenge for dollar dominance. We've seen that we started 2024 with 5 new countries, 5 new additions to BRICS, including Iran, which has an urgent need for de-dollarization because by de-dollarization, Iran could possibly escape some of the US imposed sanctions. So I do believe that this is going to be a year where we're going to see some much more concrete moves.
Super, thank you. So for the listeners, we will be doing something on de-dollarization, which is just going to be a webinar on de-dollarization. So more facts, then we will sort of counter-challenge each other on a number of things. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to shift now to Amandeep. Amandeep, what are your top 2 or 3 gray risks? Are they similar to Nicolas? Are you looking at something else? Some of the things that have not been really talked about? What are your views on this?
Thanks, Shraddha and Nicolas. I heartedly agree with the points that Nicolas has pointed out, especially related to the discontent, especially in European societies. Within Europe, I'm actually quite keen to see how that translates in the UK, just because everywhere else in Europe, it's been a shift towards the right wing. In the UK, it seems like it's going to be a shift to the Labour Party, so less right wing, but quite a bit of a transition, quite a flip. So it looks like it might be a landslide change, or it could just stay the same, but it would be very interesting to see how it pans out in that part of the world, with the cost of living crisis being the way that it is, its relationship with Europe and with the EU since 2016. So quite looking forward to see how that materializes. Another aspect for 2024, less of a risk, but more of a trend. I'm quite curious to see how the green narrative is going to come out as well, because obviously that's always at the top of the agenda, and it has been said that for 2024 it's going to be on top of the agenda as well. To me, it seems like conversations about climate will be heavily kind of in the spotlight. ESG awareness will be very much in the picture. Actual climate action to me seems like could be a while, simply because the economic needs of countries will probably lean more towards conventional sources of energy. So the transition to green, to me, does not seem like is going to be the priority for this year. Conversations around it and resource politics will definitely be up there.
I think so. In one of our weekly, we did point out that US is now the largest exporter of non-green gas, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I agree with both of you on the points, especially on the green bit. We've discussed this a number of times, that it's going to be a time of contestation of ESG standards. America is going the other way. In the World Economic Forum, for example, the green hushing, that term was used a number of times. Right, so the regulators are banning or penalizing firms that are now investing in non-fossil fuel companies, for example. That's the trend that's happening in the US. Europe is going the other way with carbon border adjustment mechanisms, making it more protectionist. Probably the Middle East is especially being in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're trying to match up with their economic priorities. So what we are seeing is different models of ESG, different models of the global standards, which means companies operating in different geographies will really have to constantly align. And then we've said it, right? They'll have to split, they'll have to diversify, and a number of things is something that we see in 2024. And yeah, the de-dollarization bit, of course, yes, the BRICS is now in place, but just in terms of the new development bank, the capitalization, will China and India ever agree on a reserve currency? How that's going to go? So as Nicolas said, it's a long way, but the trends are very clear. Cool. So the Grey Rhinos, I think from both of you are pretty clear. We could add a little later in the Q&A. Let's move on to the white elephants. You know, this is my favorite because some of the things get so overblown in the media narrative, in the social media narrative, that they take up a lot of unnecessary business resources. And I may be wrong here, of course, all of us can be, but to me, a Trump presidency, not so much, but what has been predicted will follow, like an almost revolution in America and splitting into different states and all of that, everything's been said. Maybe that's a white elephant. We need to calibrate it and see how things go. And the second one for me, and this is pretty controversial, is this constant diatribe on the Middle East regional war escalation. Yes, you're seeing new sort of conflict triggers pan out. Red Sea was one area which it's happened before, but at a much higher propensity, you could say. People have been pointing out between Iran and Pakistan. That's been going on from a low intensity for a number of years. Everything that's been hit till now has had experience of conflicts, right? So maybe we need to keep in mind that, yes, this conflict will continue, identify where these factors could be, and then take a very realistic call on whether the axis of resistance is in a position to sort of blow it out of proportion, etc. So obviously there are different actors that will involve, and that's a much detailed analysis. But what, according to both of you, Nicolas, if I may start with you, are white elephants?
Well, I would like to mention two white elephants that are very much of a moral nature, not so much of a business nature per se, but that do, of course, have a massive impact on business. First of all, we've mentioned ESG. To me, it's one major white elephant. I have a problem with ESG. You know, I do teach ESG in a university from a geopolitical standpoint. And to me, ESG from the onset has been nothing but a set of standards used by the powers out there to wage influence and to try and obtain leverage, economic leverage, industrial leverage over their competitors. You very rightly pointed out, Shraddha, that now, and I think this is the beauty of the times we are in, because the masks are falling, finally. It's becoming very clear what the actual agenda is behind many of those fancy terms. We are seeing that now we have to deal with a very wide variety of ESG standards. What ESG means in Europe and what ESG means in China, for example, those are two different animals. And by the way, those are two different animals that you would not want to put lock up in the same cage, since we are looking at our zoo here. The standards are completely different. What is important is whoever is winning that battle of the ESG standards will have a massive advantage in terms of industrial development, in terms of technology control. So to me, it is a white elephant because ESG has always been proposed as something that, nobody can contest. I mean, who here is against environmental stewardship? Raise your hand. Who here is dislikes social responsibility? Raise your hand. Who here is in favor of wanton corruption? Raise your hand. Of course, nobody is. But when you look at the way, for example, China has been implementing ESG, and I've been looking at the way they've been, proposing ESG standards throughout their Belt and Road Initiative project, it's extremely different from the way Europe is trying to do it. Europe is being extremely radical. If you allow me, I'm going to take those two extremes, Europe versus China in this ESG debate. Europe is being extremely radical. It's going for hard laws. It's going for a punitive approach, which is causing massive problems for the European industry. One example, most fund managers out there, if they want to have a good ESG rating, cannot invest in a defense company anymore. Now, let me ask you this. How do we rebuild a European defense in a time and age of a war on our borders, at our door in Ukraine? How do we rebuild European defense if we cannot channel institutional investors' money into defense companies? That is not possible because it is not ESG compliant. Same goes with nuclear energy. For the longest time in Europe, an institutional investor cannot invest in nuclear energy company without seeing its ESG standard grade being degraded. How do we build energy resilience when we are not supposed to be buying oil or gas from evil Russia if we do not switch to nuclear? France had the hardest time fighting Germany at the EU to get nuclear energy to be in the green taxonomy of energy for Europe. So this ESG thing, I think it has been a waste of time in the way we have been implementing it, especially in Europe and North America. It's time we move on. Another one before I pass on the mic to Amandeep that I would like to mention is wokism. People might be surprised, why are we even mentioning wokism in a podcast, in a webinar on geopolitical risk? Wokism has becoming prevalent in many multinational companies. For right or for wrong, I'm not here to debate whether wokism is right or wrong. I'm just saying it has become a new moral standard in many multinational companies. It is becoming an issue because wokism is being fought by many of the markets, especially in what we call sometimes abusively the global south, where those multinational companies are trying to expand. So we have a problem of ethical values, of moral values, that get rejected by the very markets that we are trying to approach, by the very markets that Western countries are trying to gain influence on, because the ones that they're facing on those markets are the likes of China, the likes of Russia, which, as everybody knows, do not carry an ounce of wokism in them. So if there is a battle of ethics, a battle of moral values, that is extremely important for companies to understand, because this is one of the reasons why, for example, Europe is losing ground in Africa. Many of the values that European companies bring with them are actually despised by those markets. So ESG and wokism.
And I think just to add to that, there's a contestation on popular culture also happening. So on the East China Sea, the maps are being redrawn. I mean, companies like Burberry, H&M, everybody found themselves in a soup when they printed a map that first was in favor of China, then it became in favor of Vietnam. It's been the same. And companies are also struggling with this. So the Disney stand on LGBTQ, for example, got quite a backlash from the right wing. So it's like they are doomed whether they do this or they do that. The entire McDonald's case in where the Israeli outlet was giving free burgers to the IDF officers. And that took a backlash across McDonald's in the Arab world. So I'm guessing culturally, you really need to get your risk assessments right. What works in one geography can land you in a soup in other geographies, especially as yes, standards are being contested, national interpretations are being contested. The whole idea of ethical values is now under contestation. And I mean, I guess as the Western markets are challenged by the non-Western markets, this is something that every company has to keep in mind. Amandeep, over to you.
Just to your point of McDonald's, as of today, it's actually Pizza Hut that's been hit. So it just seems like we are working on a very reactionary tendency. So we see something wrong, we just immediately kind of activate our wokist tendencies and then act on it. So for me, two kind of related white elephants. The first one is collapse of China. I have read a lot about how China is going to be at its slowest in 2024. It's not going to recover from everything that it's been hit with in the past year or since COVID. I don't see it that way. I think that even though it's not going to be the economic superpower that it kind of aims to be quite quickly in 2024, it doesn't seem like an absolute collapse is on the cards yet. Economic ups and downs are very normal, but to me it seems like China is on a very mature diplomatic and economic journey where it's enhancing ties in previously overlooked areas. So in the past few days alone, it has had quite valuable meetings with Ireland, with Georgia. So it has taken steps to enhance ties there. It's got a very strong network of ties in the GCC. It's got a strong network with Russia. So it doesn't seem to me that China is on a route to collapse. It just seems like every other economy, it's on an up and down journey. And the second one is a Cold War 2.0, which I think is a very dramatic way of looking at relations between the US, China, and Russia. Of course, I see where it comes from. A lot of the actors are the same. A lot of the relations are also the same, but it doesn't feel like that level of conflict is going to be reflected in 2024. It doesn't seem like it's in anyone's interest to act in that way. Of course, we are thinking about whether or not the US would have to physically intervene in a conflict-ridden zone. That is, of course, up for debate, but it doesn't seem like a Cold War 2.0 is happening just yet.
Super. So yeah, so those are, I'm guessing, the white elephants. Now I'm going to come on things that are the most difficult, the black swans, right? Again, by its very nature and definition, these are not things that can be predicted. As Donald Rumsfeld said, things that we know that we don't know. But just looking at some of the black swans, I'm particularly interested in knowing where you think new conflict stress points can emerge in 2024. You know, we have an active war in Europe. We now have an active war, if you can call that a war, skirmish, conflict, whatever. It's more than that in the Middle East. We've had an era of coups in Africa. Skirmishes are on in Taiwan Strait, and air defense identification zones are being breached. What is left? So let's start with you, Nicolas. Where do you think we're going to see, A, if you're going to see new conflicts in 2024, and B, any rerouting that any of the existing conflicts would potentially take?
Well, I think there's one that I'm quite interested in seeing how it unfolds, is this those skirmishes between Iran and Pakistan. I mean, I heard it from the horse's mouth that this is not too much. This is not something that we should worry about too much. I mean, this has happened in the past. Mr. Parikisit, could you please mute your mic, please? Could everybody mute their mic? Thank you. Yeah, it's apparently something that's happened before. It looks like it's one of those skirmishes that could be solved rather easily, rather quickly in a discrete fashion. But I'm going to be, you know, in this day and age, I think the Pandora's box has been opened by the war in Ukraine. There is certainly, some people would argue that Azerbaijan, Armenia have also opened their own Pandora box of their own. So I would like to argue that in this day and age, any skirmish should be looked at extremely carefully and extremely seriously, because there is a potential for it to actually go out of hand very quickly. Another hotspot that I think that we must be looking at extremely closely is Ethiopia. I mean, the whole Horn of Africa. What Ethiopia has been proposing recently to help diversifying trade routes away from Bab el-Mandeb Strait, this could get the likes of Somalia, the likes of Somaliland, the likes of Eritrea, very unhappy, fear of missing out kind of thing. And that could trigger renewed conflicts in that region. Remember, we have the thing in Sudan that nobody seems to be caring about anymore, that is still not over. Egypt is probably going to be extremely anxious to understand what Ethiopia has in mind. So I do believe that we have potential. It's one of those interesting things when you have a positive development, which is new ideas on how to diversify trade routes and supply chains, which could actually trigger some very negative events, because some countries will not be willing to be avoided in the new trade routes. So I do think that those two spots should be looked at very carefully.
Interesting. So for 2024, we think Asia is probably going to be status quo. Whatever is happening will probably keep happening in terms of maritime conflicts, in terms of like clash of freedom of navigation operations, etc. Okay, Amandeep, over to you.
So in terms of unpredictability, I think the Middle East will continue to remain quite unpredictable, not in the kind of Israel-Hamas way, but just the surrounding regions. I think the economic future, the future of economic growth in the region is going to be very, very unpredictable, especially with Egypt, given the losses that it's probably been through after Suez Crisis Part 2, if you will. So it seems like that could be a very Black Swan-ish area that I'd like to keep an eye on to see how they recover, if they recover, what that journey is going to look like. And also off the back of existing conflicts, how they could intensify with the role of AI in warfare. AI is on the agenda for several countries for its regulation to be at the top. So this year, I'd like to see how that would enable conflicts to be intensified. So wherever any skirmishes are, what sort of advanced level does a country have to be at to be able to exploit the negative effects of artificial intelligence? I think is going to be quite unpredictable for onlookers such as us.
Thank you, Amandeep. Just for the listeners, we're also going to be doing a detailed session on AI and critical technologies, where we'll be discussing all of this. So I think what we will need to look at as Black Swan events are really the repercussions of conflicts, right? So with interest rates at the highest, very little policy maneuver, a lot of countries undergoing debts, stresses, any supply chain disruption, any conflicts could potentially trigger off very unprecedented political happenings in different parts of the world, right? So I know we do the political index mapping where we're looking at how certain developments are impacting economies. Egypt, for example, is highly stressed. It's one of the biggest countries. And there are a lot of other countries that are undergoing economic stress, which could become worse with these conflicts. So that could be the Black Swan aspect of what we look at. So that's something that we will be keeping a close eye on. There is just one more thing we will highlight before we go in for questions. Our herd master has given us a 30 minutes uptick. So Nicolas, this is for you. Weaponization of critical minerals, right? So typically, I mean, just for the audience listening in, I know everybody's a very informed audience here, but I get these questions all the time. There are 3 points I'd like to highlight. Firstly, all critical minerals are very, very important for the upstream of every electronic, defense, national security industries that we use. Secondly, they're concentrated in some countries, right? So for example, nickel will be about 60% of supply of one thing will be in Australia. Cobalt is, I think, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nickel is in Indonesia. And China controls about 60 to 90% of refining and processing. They very intelligently place themselves at the heart of energy transformation, for example. And the third thing is that there is a gradation of these critical minerals. So there is germanium and gallium, which China incidentally imposed export restrictions on, which are a little easily substitutable in the supply chain. Then you've got the lithium and sort of the battery metals that are a little more difficult. But the ones that China controls, for example, illiquid, I keep forgetting names also, are the ones that are hardest to replace. So, and they've started now weaponization. Not only them, Indonesia has, Democratic Republic of Congo has. When at a time when industrial economies in the West are either doing domestic manufacturing or giving energy sort of transition goals. So the supply and demand is not matching. Nicolas, how is that going to play out in 2024?
I think this is going to fuel even more tensions. This is going to fuel, and by the way, in your list, I would like to add graphite as well, where China imposed export restrictions. Graphite is very problematic to have difficulty getting your hands on this, because this is what you absolutely need, just like for cobalt for electric batteries. So this is going to fuel even more tensions, the local tensions. This is actually going to make private security companies, private military companies, even more powerful in continents like Africa, because those guys are being sent to secure access, to secure processing, and to secure the delivery of those natural resources. So you will actually see through those conflicts on critical raw materials a complete change in the map of the players. Whoever is basically managing security on the ground, the types of companies that are going to be there. I was in Turkey recently for a Turkey-Africa Economic and Business Forum, and I could see that a lot of the interest for Turkish companies to go to Africa, and they are coming in hard, very aggressively, and rightfully so, is basically to get closer to those local governments and to get their share of the cake of that access to critical raw materials. So this is going to have a massive impact on the balance of power, regional and global, and this is going to have a massive impact on the nature of the players on the ground.
So just 2 lines from me. I know enough has been said about elections. To the half, like, I don't know, more than half the humanity goes to vote in some of the biggest countries, India, United States, Russia, etc. I think one thing we're monitoring, of course, the nature of how elections pan out in a number of countries, but we're also looking at trends of protectionism. You know, election years typically tend to be more protectionist. Agricultural commodities could be, for example, stopped from India. Resources could be stopped from Indonesia. There are already indications in the run-up to elections. So as Confluence, we're closely monitoring what potential supply chain disruptions could happen from an election point of view, besides the obvious look at polarization and how sort of security dynamics are going to play out, who's going to win the US elections, who's going to win the Finland elections, for example, in the background of NATO, etc. So yes, we're going to summarize all of these risks for you when we send you that 2 or 5-pager that we prepare. So don't worry. Okay, Kia, over to you. What are some of the exciting questions that you want us to answer?
First of all, we had a comment when you were talking about Black Swan events that are very hard to predict. Someone in the chat box mentioned South America, and I think we can also comment on Latin America as well. So yeah, just whatever you want to add on this comment, it's Jose Shalhoub.
I think there's also, Nicolas, I'm going to add this and ask you to comment. Possibly a conflict in South America between Venezuela and Guyana shouldn't be discarded for 2024. Your views on that?
Well, I'm going to, this is a joke, by the way, but I had high hopes on this conflict in the sense that I think this was, again, basically some actors dropping the mask and showing their true colors and showing their true intentions. So the whole discussion on this potential conflict between Venezuela and Guyana, you know, in the run-up to the elections in Venezuela, it's something that we should be looked at, but I wouldn't be overly concerned, because it looks to me like there was a lot of basically domestic narrative on the part of the Venezuelans on this one. What I would be looking out for is trying to anticipate how the constant blue wave versus pink wave that happens in Latin America, you know, those waves of governments going from the right side to the left side, and they tend to happen pretty much at the same time, or kind of in a kind of a wild geese flight. How this will pan out. Mexico will be a very important hotspot to watch, because Mexico is a major economy in that region, and there is massive discontent when it comes to AMLO's leadership over the past few years, and the inability of the government basically to solve the problem of safety and the drug cartel violence, etc. It will be interesting to see in Colombia. I know that Gustavo Petro is not going for re-election this year, but the amount of discontent in Colombia regarding the Petro's administration, the various scandals that hit his family. I do believe his son was involved in a corruption scandal. This is going to be very interesting to see what kind of maneuverability it leaves his administration. He's trying to come up with some very big words. You know what he said at the Davos, at the World Economic Forum, that liberté, égalité, fraternité should not be written on the front of French official buildings anymore. It should be written in South Africa for what South Africa has been pushing for, you know, in accusing Israel of doing a genocide in Gaza. He's trying to buy time. He's trying to change the topic of the conversation. But again, I hear from the horse's mouth, people I know in Colombia, they're telling me we are not forgetting what he is not doing in Colombia. And he could be paying for that in terms of popularity and support in parliament. So I would say I would keep an eye on this kind of blue wave, pink wave happening in Latin America. Another Black Swan event concerning the Americas in general, and this is a pretty radical one. I would like to propose the possibility that Donald Trump, of course, gets into the White House back, but that he is rapidly incapacitated in one way or another. This is one of those very ugly black swans, those things that we don't know, because I'm not privy to this kind of information. But it is something that the US has done before, assassinating their own president, falling suddenly ill. If this happens, it would be extremely problematic to read. Remember, we had that election in Taiwan with a pro-independence president holding on to power. China would probably be extremely nervous if we have this Taiwan Trump administration to deal with and suddenly Trump being incapacitated. So I think this is one of those elements of uncertainty that we cannot completely throw out of the picture. Again, the US has a culture, a tradition, I would say, of incapacitating some of their own presidents, impeachment, for example. So I would like to, companies listening in to factor in this issue.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very real possibility. Okay, Kia, next question.
Yes, we just had a new animal added to our zoo, so the pink flamingo, which is defined in the comment section as a predictable event that is ignored due to cognitive biases of senior leader or a group of leaders trapped by a powerful institutional forces. So the comment cites Ukraine and Gaza situations in particular for pink flamingos.
Okay, so sorry, pink flamingo is something which exists, but because of cognitive biases of the senior leaders, it's ignored. Is that the question? Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, and is there, do they want to know more pink flamingo events, or is that just a comment?
It was the question exactly was, would you agree that Israel in Gaza and Ukraine in Ukraine are experiencing a pink flamingo effect? And how does these situations, what should we take note of from this situation?
Okay, I mean, as much as I've understood it, for the Middle East, I can talk. Yes, there is a cognitive bias on how we perceive actors. You know, I've heard it so many times that Iran is an irrational actor. There is nothing irrational about what the axis of resistance does, for example. It's very, very smartly, again, I mean, at the cost of sounding this, I'm not admiring them, these are just facts. Iran has built a proxy network which is unparalleled. You know, each of their enemies are surrounded by a proxy. So it's Israel is Hamas and Hezbollah. For the Saudis, it is Houthis. Then there are militias in Iran. And so, yes, when we're looking at things, you know, these things keep coming up that they will block the Strait of Hormuz. I've been hearing that since the Iranian Revolution. Right? And the thing is, they're irrational, they can do it. So yes, there is that cognitive bias. There's also the aspect of religion that comes in, which tends to complicate analysis. So I agree with that. At the moment, I think it's probably a combination of a white elephant and a gray jellyfish. So things are escalating out of control in a number of places. But I also think that a lot of people who monitor this region can effectively predict that. For Ukraine, I'm guessing the bias was when it started is that Ukraine, if not will win from Russia, it will at least put Russia back on track, which probably has not really happened. Going forth, there are now predictions that there is going to be a final Russian onslaught and maybe a partition of Ukraine because the West support is sort of dwindling. But I mean, for all the analysts here who started off, I think we all understood how the American Western Alliance works. It was just meant to disrupt Russia. It was never meant to make Ukraine win. So in that sense, yeah, I guess you could call them pling flamingo effect. Cool. I'm not sure if I've answered the question. Whoever's asked that question, can you just probably reply back to us and tell us if we've been able to address your query? Till then, Kia, why don't we go on to the next one?
Yes, I would like to jump back to the beginning of the webinar with the first comment, which is a question. Here it goes. Is there a stable post-globalistic geopolitical configuration to expect? So the comment uses BRICS and Global South and the West that are mostly technological development level divided. And the question is, can the world be really divided into zones that do not complement each other?
I think all three of us disagree with each other. So Nicolas, why don't you start?
I think whoever is expecting a stability, even with a kind of a trilateral type of word, you're going to have to be patient. I'm afraid so. No, I think we are at the beginning of a fairly long cycle of instability. Of course, China-US, it's something that we can count on. I would add Russia on the side of China for that matter. That confrontation is very clear. Europe on the side of the US and Russia on the side of China. But the major question mark that I do believe will feed this instability for the longest time is how will the so-called Global South, the likes of BRICS, how will they position themselves? And their positioning will change from topic to topic, from issue to issue. Wherever their strategic interests lie, sometimes they will be on one side, sometime or another. They will try to be on the fences when it is possible. So I think we are in an extremely complex world. It will remain complex. I do agree. I remember there was an article written by a Chinese officer who now teaches international relations at Tsinghua University. He wrote that, I believe, in the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. And he was basically saying that the battle for influence over the Global South has already been won by China, more or less. I kind of tend to agree with this. But he was also reminding everyone that the battlefield now is Europe. Europe will be the battlefield of China versus the US type of influence. So if only for that, this instability will continue. And if you bring back in what I said at the beginning of the webinar, one of the first Grey Rhino that I mentioned, which is the massive popular discontent in Europe, if this translates into political wins for so-called right-wing parties, pro-sovereignty parties, this could mean that Europe drifts much closer towards China/Russia, if only for the construction of a European sovereignty and to get out of US domination, which many of those parties consider is at the root of the weakness of Europe. So this instability will continue. We need to wait and see, what is the tipping point for the European populations. I would like to remind listeners that many of the European countries have a history, a tradition of revolts, and ugly ones. I'm French, I'm based in Paris. I don't have to remind anybody of how the French Revolution happened. This can go very quickly, and this can be very difficult to anticipate. So it will remain extremely changing, extremely fluid. I would not be betting on a new form of world order to settle in quickly.
Yeah, and I would agree. Just looking at Asia, I personally feel that the battle lines are going to be drawn sooner between China and the US, and everyone will have to take sides. So yeah, that's what we're monitoring at the moment. Whether, of course, BRICS and everything is important, but I think the battle lines have been drawn. Cool. Yeah. Sorry, Amandeep, do you have any points that you want to add? Or could we go on to the next question?
Yeah, no, agree with that. I think stability is probably not on the cards just yet. There's a lot of discontent. There's a lot of suspicion across regions. So yeah, agree with both of you. There's no concept of stability or globalist stability at the moment, for sure.
Yeah, next question, please.
So Shraddha, we have a response to your response on pink flamingos. The comment reads, thanks Shraddha, I was hoping you'd identify a few other such situations globally that we should take note of.
Now that is like a thought-provoking question. Why
I
don't we
have
go?
one.
Yeah.
I have one. I have
Yeah.
a pink flamingo. Pink flamingo is the way European governments and Brussels will be dealing with the popular discontent in Europe. It's very much shaped by the massive cognitive bias that many of the European elites have, which is the moral high ground is held by a certain number of people, and this is the major disagreement between the elites and I would say the general population. These people do not know what is good for Europe. We are starting to see in the media and coming from many of the elites the narrative that the farmers in Germany and in France are anti-European, that they're weakening Europe by demonstrating like that. So this all comes from a very strong cognitive bias, the inability by many of the governments to understand the discontent. And as I said before, those revolts compound with interest. When you look at how the whole thing evolved in France, people remember the Yellow Vest movement. Very few people remember that the Yellow Vest movement picked up from where the Red Cap movement left off. It was an earlier movement centered mostly in Brittany region of France, of people demonstrating against the installation of ecological toll booth. And then this movement disappeared. And then when the Yellow Vest movement happened, for another reason, a project of an increase in the tax on diesel fuel, they picked up from that and they added on new reasons for discontent on top of it. And then this disappeared. And now we have the farmers' movement, which picks up from this with new motives of discontent. It is extremely serious. And the cognitive bias of many of the governments that we have in Europe, because of the ideology and the majority philosophy, makes it impossible for them to fathom the depth of that discontent and to envision how it could translate on the political stage. It has happened in Netherlands, so let's hope that Netherlands will be an example that everybody remembers. But I do believe that we have here one massive pink flamingo in Europe.
I think another flamingo would be Indo-Pacific. I think everybody assumes that because of economic linkages, there is not going to be a spiraling of conflict in the region. As I said, the battle lines have been drawn and it's very fast. The supply chain changes are happening. We cannot back on the fact that there was a joke that used to float around a couple of years back that Apple is what keeps peace in the Indo-Pacific, because Apple had operations between China, Vietnam, Taiwan, everybody. So a lot of these supply chains, obviously, we keep hearing that obviously the TSMC is having problems in setting up chip plant in Arizona, but very strategic plans are being implemented at the Indo-Pacific level to sort of reconfigure supply chains. And we'll just have to see how that pans out. A conflict in the Indo-Pacific is no longer out of the cards, and that could be one of the pink flamingos. But yeah, that's a great question. I think we'll add this to our risk management analysis. Maybe one or two more questions, Kia, and then we'll close it.
Sure, we have a question turned towards more economic issues. So will the inflation go up due to conflicts? So for example, supply disruption, and will oil prices be going up? What can be expected for 2024?
If I get this right, I'm going to take a 1 million dirham from whoever has asked this question. So Nicolas, do you want to take a shot at it? And
I haven't worked on on price level predictions for a while now, so I'm not going to try and set a level for WTI futures, for example, for 2024. No, but obviously we are going to stay in this high inflation type of environment. It's interesting to see that OPEC is doing quite a lot to try and strike a very subtle balance to make sure that the prices don't spike out of control as soon as a new crisis arises, but that also that prices do not correct too much when things seem to be getting better. So they seem to be having their hand on the pulse, which I believe it's actually good news, because it is one of the few aspects of stability that we can work on at the moment, and God knows that there are not that many out there. But yeah, we are going to stay in an environment of high inflation. The problem we have is that we are in a perfect storm at the moment when it comes to prices. We are in a time, we've said it enough, of continued conflicts and multiplying conflicts, local and regional. So that obviously impacts access to resources, supply chains. But at the same time, we are in a technological transition, which means that the new technologies that are being proposed are still fairly costly. So all of those conspire to create this perfect storm, meaning that this environment of high prices is here to stay. And again, this will keep fueling the massive discontent, because people are feeling the pinch, especially the middle classes are feeling the pinch. I mean, I've said it many times, I do believe that there are some of my students here online today. I've said it many times in class. This vote by the European Parliament to phase out thermal engines, combustion engines for cars by 2035, it's going to be a massive disaster for Europe, because it means we're going to go all electric. The average European car company puts on the market a basic electric car for about 25 to 30,000 euros. Who's going to be able to buy this? And the only electric car that the impoverished middle class will be able to buy will be a Chinese one. So then we're back to square one. How can we rebuild strategic autonomy, economic resilience? And this is going to be the case in many countries. So I would not want to be in one of those post-industrialized economies right now. I would rather be, in those countries like where we are based, where Confluence Consultants is based, in the UAE, because those countries, they find a way to manage inflation. They find a way to shield their population from the strongest negative effects of inflation. But this perfect storm of conflicts and energy transition and new technologies, it's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt very bad, and it's going to last.
I think we would stay away from predicting oil prices, because it's a number of factors that play in. It is the politics of oil prices now. It's no longer the economics of oil prices. So yeah, we'd probably just leave it at that. Yeah, let's have a last question.
There were two other comments, especially on the European Union. So one comment...
is there anything on Asia? I think we've done quite a bit on European Union. Is there anything else on other parts of the world that you're seeing? No? There is something sorry, may I?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Reshoring is key agenda for major Western economies to decouple from China. Chances of Trump coming increasing. What about Mexico? Yeah. I'm guessing what about Mexico means how Mexico is going to do in terms of sort of economic growth, etc. Right? Okay. Let me just take a shot at this. I don't know how many of you and everybody who knows me knows I love this book. It's called The Next 100 Years, which basically has spoken about Mexico emerging as one of those economic superpowers in the years coming. Why? Because closest to the United States, in a continent that the United States can control. So a lot of automobile sort of supply chains have moved to Mexico, but it's a route that the Chinese companies are taking to, for example, reach the United States. So if you see the trade numbers, the Mexico-China trade has really stepped up, and a lot of it is then being sent to the US. So these are also ways and means of a changing supply chain maneuver. But yes, I think Mexico will probably benefit from the nearshoring to the United States. especially in sectors like automobile, in chemicals, in sort of labor-intensive aspects of how this goes. And yeah, maybe a couple of years, the Mexican economy has basically shown it's been on the growth trajectory. They need to get the politics right, of course. There's been issue of crime, etc. But I'm bullish on the Mexican economy, and so is Richard Sharma. So yeah, we'll take it from there.
If I may add one last thing, Shraddha, to this about Mexico, I would like to warn everybody about the risk that Mexico ends up like Vietnam. If everybody remembers, Vietnam was the preferred destination at the very beginning of this decoupling from China story. The problem with Vietnam, and I see the same kind of factors in Mexico, is size, a lack of production capacity. Is Mexico able to pick up everything that the companies need to pull out of China from? This is why the Vietnam story ended fairly quickly, because people realized that Vietnam doesn't have the critical mass. And I think the question is the same with Mexico. Does Mexico have the critical mass to absorb the production capacity so that a decoupling from China works, French shoring, etc.? And second of all, does Mexico have the workforce that is skilled enough to replace the Chinese workforce that those companies were relying on before? So I do think that I agree with you, Shraddha, that the proximity, the French shoring, those are massively positives, but I would warn against the problem of size, capacity, capability to go up the value ladder fast enough.
No, I agree. And I don't think any one country can anyway replace China. It's going to be certain segments doing really well in some parts of the country, etc. So yeah, okay. Should we close, or should we maybe hear just one more question? Yeah.
I'm just the very last comment. In a situation where you see the comparatively less powerful economies like South Africa, Ireland are participating on the other sides of the major economic superpowers and their allies. How do you see any chances of sanctions on them?
Against the side of the United States, I'm guessing that's the question. They're on the other side of the United States and European Union. I don't see. I mean, sanctions as a policy has not really worked in the international arena. I mean, how many countries are in sanctions, right? So you have Russia under heavy sanctions. Some parts of the Chinese are sanctioned. Iran is under sanction. North Korea is under sanctions. So many parts of companies across the world under sanctions. I don't see Ireland and South Africa, not at least in terms of hard-hitting nationwide sanctions. Maybe entity here and there like they do in the UAE. But no, I don't think any chances of any sort of punitive sanctions that could potentially impact business. I don't see that.
Can I just quickly add on something to this idea? So when we're thinking about the South Africa-Ireland issue, we're also thinking about 18 other countries backing South Africa. So I would imagine that sanctioning 18 other countries along with South Africa would be quite cumbersome, if anything. And I would also imagine that Ireland, as an EU member, is probably not going to be at risk of any sanctioning. So yeah, I agree with you there.
I think they've chosen their battles very intelligently. There is a lot that will be needed for them to get the eventual goal that they're aiming at. So yeah, I think they're okay at the moment. Yeah, so I think we should now close. If anybody has any additional questions, we're all available. You can send us a message on our Confluence Consultants LinkedIn page, our emails. Please, if you have any contradictory opinions, we'd love to hear, because that's what helps us strengthen our sort of analysis. But yeah, thank you, everybody. Any last comments from anybody on the panel?
I just want to thank the whole team for organizing this. Thanks you for all the participants for the great questions. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. You, Sam. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Learned a lot.
Hey, Samantha.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Outstanding. Kea, Amandeep, I mean, other two have been, of course, listening for a long time. But yeah, thank you. You were outstanding.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting as well, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.